and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, I want you to consider a troubling statistic as we start the show. One child in five globally are currently living in or fleeing from conflict zones, which has been contributing to unprecedented levels of forced displacement. Children make up 41% of all displaced people. Now, to quote Unicef Executive Director Catherine Russell, children are living in a world that is increasingly hostile to their rights. So in the wake of an unprecedented surge in children's rights violations and abuses, the urgency to protect our most vulnerable is more pressing than ever. Joining me on the show to discuss this further is Sheema Sen Gupta, Director of the Child Protection Program Group at Unicef. Sheema, thank you for being on the show with me today. I appreciate your time. Maybe we could begin our conversation with some insights as to what child protection entails, especially when we think about children in vulnerable children in conflict zones. Maybe you can share a little bit about what it is that you do and how UNICEF approaches child protection.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you for having me on this show. Very happy to be here to actually discuss child protection concerns. So child protection, as UNICEF sees it, is really about protecting children from violence, abuse, exploitation, neglect, harmful practices. So a whole package of things that actually protects children and keeps them safe. Of course, child protection is a right of children, and this right is actually given to them by the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which Malaysia also has, of course, ratified. What we do is looking at protection of children's rights across various contexts. The development context, so, countries which are part of a development process, it could be lower income countries, middle income, and some of the upper middle income, but also in humanitarian contexts and protecting children in those contexts. Our child protection work focuses on prevention, so doing everything we can and supporting governments to do everything we can so that we can prevent children from being exploited and abused, because that's the best way of protecting children. But then we also know that, there will always be, for some reason or the other, in some context or the other, that children do need response services, and it's also to provide that response. Just to give a few examples, maybe if it makes it easier to understand, some specific child protection violations are sexual exploitation, physical abuse, child marriage, recruitment of children by armed forces, by gangs, child labor, and then we also have in some parts FGM. So these are all the different kinds, and FGM is female genital mutilation, which is also practiced in some places. So what we do is work with governments, work with civil societies and communities to develop strategies and systems to actually protect children from these violations.
A lot of the work we do is to come up with, in a contextual way, come up with a system that will help address
these cultural, social, and economic determinants. A big one nowadays that we talk about is the interlinkage between gender and children. So, when you look at violence against children or ending violence against children, there is this whole connection between violence against women and violence against children. If mothers are abused or mothers face violence, so do children. What does that mean in terms of children growing up? We do a lot of work with the private sector as well. We do have good partners across the world globally and also here in Malaysia in the private sector, because they do understand the importance of protecting children. And in many, many contexts in the world, child protection is also often the last resort for the most vulnerable children.
Right.
I think I'll
Right. So Sheema, when you say that one of the work focuses a lot on the prevention of these abuses of children's rights, the prevention to protect children. So how do we think about that? Given the examples that you talked about with sexual exploitation, with trafficking persons that involve children, child marriage even, how do you prevent these abuses from taking place?
So, the first basis of prevention is to ensure that there is a system, a child protection system that will protect children. Pretty much like every country in the world has a health system, right? So if a child is sick, or even when a child is born, there is the vaccination, which happens, there is an immunization program which the health system has, and then parents know to take their kids to the hospital or the doctor when something happens. And there is a health system which is equipped with vaccinators, nurses, doctors, and so on to help children to be healthy. Similarly, for child protection, there is a system that needs to be in every country, needs to have a system. And this system looks at the legislation and the normative framework. So do you have laws that protect? So you just mentioned child marriage. Does a country have a law that actually defines what is the age of a child to begin with? And that under the Convention on the Rights of the Child is 18. So if every person under the age of 18 is a child, then if you would define child marriage, you would say, what is the age of marriage for a child? And there must be a law that says, okay, this is the age. 18 is when when an adult can get married because they're not children anymore. And a country would say, what is child marriage? And what are those legislative protections that you have for children at that age? So it's about having the right legislation, the right laws, the systems that will implement these laws. Then it is about having, for the response side, a social work system. Are there carers? Are there social workers who can identify when children are being abused? If there's violence in a family, if there's violence in school, is there a system by which there are nominated people, say social workers, probation officers, teachers even, who will identify and who will know where to report? So all of this coming together in a system is the protective framework for a child.
Right. And how do we think about that for countries who lack those, for countries and communities that lack those systems to protect children? You think of often laws and policies not being the most child-centric. Often children are an afterthought when we think about protecting their rights. How do you work with countries who have that approach, Sheema?
So yes, and it's a good question, Melissa, because we do, as I said, globally, UNICEF has child protection programs in 150 countries. So you can well imagine that these 150 countries have different kinds of legislative systems and all of that. So depending on the context, we do start. So we look at, our interlocutor, our partner in any place is the government. So our first step is working with government. We see with the government and actually all governments except the United States have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So in all the 150 countries that we have child protection programs, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been ratified. We use that as the starting point. So what we do is we look at, the legislation or even the constitution that a country has and what are provisions for children in that constitution. We compare that with the protections provided under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And then we try and get them to align. We provide support to the government if they need technical support, evidence of what has worked, data from other similar countries, and then we start this process. It's a partnership where we work with the country to develop these.
Are there any maybe success stories that you that have been memorable to you in your partnership with governments to ensure that the laws and policies are child-centric, that they uphold protecting children's rights?
Actually, there are several, right? Because we work across the globe and we work with many countries, as I said. In my experience, when I was working on child protection in Somalia many years ago, they had not yet ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so they were at that point writing up their new provisional constitution. This was way back in 2012. And we worked with them to put in a chapter on children. We worked with them to advocate for the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which they did. So that was a very successful story. And similarly, in many other countries, we do several things which then help frame. I was most recently in Iraq prior to this as the representative, and the team there worked on a child protection policy with the government. And here in Malaysia, I know there is the child protection policy that the team here has worked with the government and now are working on a costed action plan. So there are many good examples, of course, from around the globe.
Okay, could I just get you to zoom in on Malaysia, since you mentioned it? How do you view the current landscape of child protection in Malaysia, and where do you see the areas for improvement here?
Well, I'm glad you asked me this, because my colleagues asked me this a little while ago. I've spent 2 days meeting with our government partners and ministers. And as UNICEF's Global Director of Child Protection, and who also happens to be a Malaysian, I think what I said to them is, I'm very hopeful and optimistic, because the partners, the government partners we met, actually have positive developments. So, for instance, now there is within the Ministry of Women, Family and Child Development, there is a dedicated department for children. There is an office of the Commissioner for Children. So, you know, there are all these new bills that have passed and amendments to bills. One very good example that we always hear of, even sitting in New York, I had heard of it, and then I met with the law minister today as well, is, you know, Malaysia has demonstrated its commitment to protecting children in the digital world as well. When they looked at amending the sexual offences bill to make sure that even online sexual exploitation was included in it. So there are many positive developments. Of course, there's lots more, you know, that can be done. And I know from all the discussions that there's commitment to move towards that. So for me, I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic. I do believe there is, of course, discussions on the Citizenship Act, and there are issues, some of them there that are moving forward, and others will be, I'm hopeful, to come, I hope.
Okay, all right then. We're going to take a quick break here. We'll be right back with more with Sheema Sen Gupta from UNICEF in just a few minutes. Stay tuned to Consider This. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. I'm chatting tonight to Sheema Sen Gupta, Director of the Child Protection Program at UNICEF. Sheema, so we were talking a little bit about prevention of abuses to children's rights just before the break. And I wanted to talk to you now about what happens during times of conflict and crisis, or natural disasters, or humanitarian crisis. How UNICEF approaches protecting children's rights then. What safeguards are in place to protect children who are currently living amidst conflict and crises?
Thank you, Melisa. This is a very important question, because as you can see, you know, the number of armed conflicts around the world are on the rise, right? So globally in 2023, we had 25 country situations and 1 regional situation of enhanced monitoring. And now, you know, when you look at it, you see that there is an increased responsibility for us as well to monitor and report on grave child violations. So what we found is more than 400 million children in 2023 lived in or were fleeing conflict zones. And you said at the beginning also, reported our executive director. So obviously in such situations, there is so much that we have to do. And you also, it's very difficult to just speak of conflicts, because now you also have armed conflicts, and then you have them layered with other issues. So you might have an armed conflict with a climate-related crisis, for instance. So you have these complex layers which pose several threats to children, and this causes forced displacement. And we saw in 2023 that forced displacement of children reached unprecedented levels, with just 30% of the global population you have 30% of the global population, which then accounted for 41% of the displaced people in the world. So it's quite a high number.
Sheema, could you just elaborate, maybe give me an example? So how does, say for instance, as you said, the different layers and how they intersect. So how does armed conflict intersect with a climate-related crisis and intersect with displacement and separation? And how does that impact, at the heart of it, vulnerable children?
So for instance, if you have situation, as you know, there's been famine in East Africa as well, and in many other countries. So if you have a situation, for instance, and we've seen that in the Eastern African region, including in Somalia, currently, I'm talking about where you have conflict, which has been ongoing for many years. It's a fragile situation. And then you have famine. So children and their families have to move to survive. Either they're running away from the conflict, or they're also not able to source their food. And sometimes it's easy for them to go from place A to B. But then because of the famine, they would probably, instead of just being displaced within their own countries, they have to look to another country for support. So that's the forced displacement that happens to children. And all of this pose a more complex threat, because whenever there is movement, there is more likelihood of separation of children. So for instance, I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo in September, and they had a resurgence of conflict in the east. And when kids with their mums were actually fleeing the conflict, they got separated. And then suddenly you have all these young kids who were without their parents. And that puts them at more danger, like increased danger, because they can be exploited, the abuse, the violence they face, the threats they face. So that's how it gets more complicated. So in such situations, for child protection, again, what we are looking at, of course, then is primarily the response that we can work on with whoever the authorities are on the ground at that time, with our NGO partners, with, so you find partnerships on the ground, people who can provide the services. And child protection services in such situations become very important. One of the things that we do right in the beginning is to ensure that we are able to identify children who are separated from their families, so that we can actually record and then try and trace and find their families for them, for them to be reunited.
That sounds like a big challenge, the task of reuniting separated children to their families within, who are currently living through conflict. Has that been possible in many cases?
Yes, in many cases it has been possible. And just to let you know, I mean, last year we provided alternative care and reunification to over 253,000 children across the globe in different countries, different situations of conflict. But, I mean, that sounds like a big number and it sounds like good news, but also there are children who we often can't reunite, either because they've lost their families, lost to death, or we are unable to find them as well. So we do our best, and we strive to do better, but there are, of course, children who are left out sometimes and not reunited, not reunified.
Right. And so what happens to children who have survived living through conflict? Hopefully, in cases they are out of the immediate armed conflict zone. What happens to them, Sheema, and how might UNICEF be working to protect them?
So what we also do in countries where countries or regions within a country, there might be a place that is conflict affected, but the rest not, is we also look at working with the governments there on establishing services that are open to receiving these children. So these children may be forcefully, like I said, forcefully displaced. They could be refugees. They could be internally displaced within their own countries. And the UN has a system for that. Within that, UNICEF works on the child protection aspects of it, in addition to all the other health, nutrition, and education services that we do. So what we would do is, like I said, we start with the registration, because so that we know we don't lose any child. Registration of children is so important. And then we look at the other one, which is about mental health and psychosocial support, because trauma is always associated with any kind of separation, any kind of forced displacement and conflict, obviously. So we set up services which provide, sometimes the first step is to set up child-friendly spaces where we are able to identify the mental health and psychosocial needs of children. We work with teams to set up services that respond to these mental health and psychosocial needs. And of course, there are times when we have to refer them to, more clinical services. So that's the other thing that is very important to us, the mental health and psychosocial support services. In areas where you have, say, it's a conflict and therefore you have landmines and so on, we also look at providing mine risk education, where we work with families, communities to talk about explosive remnants, to be careful, how to protect themselves and so on. Mm-hmm. The other thing that happens is gender-based violence, right? Because when girls and boys, but a lot of it, we see there are more girls impacted than boys, especially when they're alone, or especially when it's a situation of conflict. There is gender-based violence. There's a surge in gender-based violence. And this can be, any kind of displacement, any kind of emergency, whether it's linked to conflict, climate, any other situation. And again, we've seen recently in Haiti, where it's a different kind of conflict. It's gang violence, right? Or the conflict in Sudan from last year, which has continued. We've documented widespread violence against girls and women. And similarly, like I said, when I visited Democratic Republic of Congo, similar situations. So in many of these conflicts, we actually have documented a big surge in violence against girls and women as well.
Right. Well, what about the current war in Gaza? You mentioned a few of the conflict zones, but the current war in Gaza has been the deadliest war for children in recent times. How does the scale of this crisis compare to the other conflict zones that UNICEF has responded to in terms of its impact on children?
Well, as Melisa, this is again a very current one, and as you just said, it is one of the worst ones we've seen, right? And the situation is bad, and it's getting worse, and we can see that. What we have found is that, or what we all see every day, I think it's all of us, but also what we see, because we do have an office for the Palestinians as well. Nowhere in Gaza is safe. And we have seen that the rate of death and injury amongst children is just staggering. So it is an extremely sad situation. It's now over 5 months of ongoing bombardment. thousands of children have been injured and many have been killed. And then, of course, we know that, under the rubble, there are many children who could not be saved at any given time. And then with the continued bombing, we see injured children keep reporting to hospitals with severe burns, with injuries. And because of the situation, they're not always able to receive the medical aid and treatment that they need. So yes, and children actually, roughly, they make up about half the population of Gaza. And so, of course, children are disproportionately affected and impacted by the situation in Gaza. So it is obviously a very, very serious situation, absolutely heartbreaking.
Sheema, unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I want to thank you for sharing your experiences with us. I appreciate you taking time to speak to me today. That was Sheema Sen Gupta, Director for the Child Protection Program Group at Unicef, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.